Over the years, Final Fantasy has played host to some iconic and unforgettable stories. In the beginning, earlier installments of the franchise featured simpler narratives and character rosters, but as the series evolved, the developers at Square sought to push the boundaries of their games as a storytelling medium and aimed to create content that was more compelling and engaging. Thus, they would gradually begin to place greater emphasis on story development, and this would see games progressively feature more complex narratives and elaborate character growth. But in the midst of such intricacies, there would exist moments or details that would have a rather strange and unexplained place in the story, whether it be a scenario with no apparent context, an atmospheric phenomenon amongst the characters, or simply no follow-up to certain significant occurrences. These would essentially become plot holes that left players perplexed and eager for answers. Interestingly, a considerable number of these inconsistencies in the plot would persist in the form of unanswered questions and unresolved mysteries, and even after long periods of time, they would never really receive a satisfactory explanation. That's why for today's video, we've decided to delve into a bunch of these unsolved mysteries and investigate the clues behind them. So strap yourselves in as we begin our journey with the curious case of what happened to Banon in Final Fantasy VI. When looking at Final Fantasy as a whole, Final Fantasy VI boasts one of the most extensive roster of characters ever, and this would be expanded upon even further when including the several guest characters that are available to play for a limited period of time. However, if we're comparing those guest characters, Banon would stand as one of the most crucial. Banon was first introduced as the head of the Returners, an important rebel faction that opposed the Gestalian Empire and counted several of the game's main characters amongst its ranks. But in addition to spearheading the resistance, Banon would also act as a guiding figure and moral compass for the party as a whole. He would inspire a greater purpose in Terra in joining the Returners to use her powers for good, and he would advise the party on numerous occasions, such as directing them to seek aid from the Espers against the Empire. As such, he had a significant impact on the party's course of adventure for a good portion of the game, but his presence would oddly enough not be felt for long. Following the destruction of Vector at the hands of the Espers and the Empire's supposed surrender, Banon would express his uncertainty at the idea of trusting the Empire in their search for the Espers to make amends. Although his intuition would prove correct, this would very strangely be the final encounter with Banon, as he would never be seen again. Considering how crucial Banon was in the struggle between the Returners and the Empire, his absence was felt tremendously. And it was also odd, considering he was the leader of the Resistance and was featured so prominently in the first half of the game. In light of this absence, it has naturally led to people wondering what exactly happened to Banon, and in this regard, there has been plenty of speculation. For one, there is some belief that he may have been killed by the Empire upon the revelation of their deception. This could potentially be supported by Edgar's statement that the party had barely escaped Vector upon discovering the trap. He could have also perished during the cataclysmic collapse of the World of Balance into the World of Ruin. But there is another intriguing theory, that Banon, in actuality, led a double life as Duncan Harcourt, the mentor of Sabin and Vargas, and that his vanishing act was simply him retreating into this persona as a means of going into hiding. Some compelling evidence would support this theory, such as Banon and Duncan having identical sprites, which would only be distinguishable by a palette swap. A YouTuber by the name of Leonard Phillips, who operates a channel called The Returners' Hideout, would actually conduct a thorough analysis of this theory, highlighting the eerie hints surrounding it. Though these theories regarding Banon would have some weight, they ultimately remain speculation, as we would never really get any sort of true follow-up regarding his status. Interestingly, when Hironobu Sakaguchi himself was questioned about the fate of Banon, he simply encouraged players to use their imaginations. Aerith's death was no doubt one of the most shocking and pivotal moments of Final Fantasy VII, as well as video game history as a whole. Such was its impact that it would even inspire Japanese fans to submit a petition for her revival. The push would even go on to spawn numerous rumours of in-game tricks to keep her alive, all of which would turn out to be false. But even though it was clear she would never return to the party, it was possible to still see Aerith in-game following her death at the conclusion of Disc 1. Upon re-entering the Sector 5 church after the events in Mideel and Cloud's return to the party, Aerith could be seen tending to the flowers. However, stepping across a particular area on the ground or attempting to leave the church would cause her image to flicker and vanish out of sight. This one-time occurrence would be cryptically dubbed Aerith's Ghost. With little context as to what was happening, it was believed by some to be a glitch, and interestingly enough, there were actually confirmed glitches associated with the event. The first would involve choosing a certain dialogue option when speaking to the Nibelheim innkeeper during the Calm flashback, which would bar the player from witnessing Aerith's ghost. The second of these would be a character placement glitch, in which characters with assigned positions in the Sector 5 church would appear in incorrect places for a brief moment. But these glitches would actually be separate entities from the appearance of Aerith's ghost. And while the nature of the ghost scene has never been officially confirmed, there is evidence to suggest that its inclusion was in fact intentional, and one such implication could be found in Final Fantasy VII's debug room. There, players could find an option called After Aerith's Death, and when selected, players would be transported into the Sector 5 church to witness this scenario. Moreover, there would also be a dummied out NPC with dialogue claiming to have seen a woman disappear in the church and call it haunted. And while the game didn't give many further clues, there was a small reference in Advent Children. At the end of the film, Cloud could properly see Aerith's spirit one last time in the Sector 5 church before she disappeared into the light. But whether or not that was connected to the ghost scenario from the original game is purely speculation. Later, however, in an interview with Yoshinori Kitase, more light would be shed on the event. When asked to explain the nature of Aerith's ghost, Kitase simply responded that he would leave it to the players' imaginations. Although this answer was ambiguous, the fact he did not flat out shoot it down, as he has done with some other fan theories, perhaps alludes to the ghost having some kind of deeper meaning. Among the many titles in the franchise, Final Fantasy IX stood out for several reasons, one of which was its enthralling storyline and intricately crafted universe. Like many narratives in the franchise, Final Fantasy IX's storyline was complex and rich in detail, featuring a plethora of events and awe-inspiring moments. However, due to its extensive content, there were also instances where the story left us with more questions than answers. Some of these would include the unknown fate of the Burmesian king or the mysterious backstory of Lani, but perhaps one of the most perplexing of these occurrences would be the existence of Vivi's sons seen at the end of the game. Just like Vivi, his offspring would also be black mages, but the nature as to how they were born would leave many stumped, as the key ingredient to creating black mages would be the cryptic substance known as mist. However, by the game's end, mist will be wiped from the world of Gaia, thus, this would beg the question as to just how Vivi's sons came to be without the key ingredient. Of course, much speculation would surround this occurrence, with some ideas being that Vivi possibly made use of the Black Mage factory in Dali and used the prototype procedure used for his own creation to generate his offspring, but this would still not explain how they would make up for the missing mist component. One potential solution actually comes via Kuja. After the eradication of the mist, following the defeat of the Soul Cage, Kuja would remark that while the mist could no longer be created, it would still lurk in caves and forests. He would then declare that he could still make monsters with magic. This might potentially explain how Vivi's sons were able to exist after the fall of the Aether Tree, as he could have made use of the residual mist lingering around Gaia as well as his own magic. But whether or not this was the actual course of action taken by Vivi remains unknown. In light of Final Fantasy XV's tumultuous development, substantial narrative changes were made as the project progressed. This would end up creating quite a few plot holes across the Final Fantasy XV universe, and the development team would then try their best to plug these holes through various updates and pieces of downloadable content, as well as a novel titled Final Fantasy XV: Dawn of the Future. While these updates and additions would provide more context to the world of Eos and its characters, we would still be left with some lingering questions, and one of those would involve the supposed name of the game's main antagonist, Arden. In a major plot twist, Arden, who would parade himself as Arden Izunia for most of the game, would reveal his name to be Arden Lucis Kylum, a blood relative of Noctis. Although much of his motives would make sense upon learning about his history, there would still be one overarching question: who was Izunia, and what was the significance of Arden taking on that name? In the soliloquy where Arden unveiled his true identity, he first addressed the nature of Izunia by saying, "You'll never guess whose name Izunia was." This statement could suggest that either Arden himself was ignorant to the name's roots, or that the person to whom the name belonged was of great significance. However, the context behind the name then became more intricate due to disparities that existed between Final Fantasy XV's various language versions. In the French and German renditions, the name received a more elaborate backstory, stating that Arden was the eldest child of the Izunia family, which was eventually renamed as the Lucis Kylum lineage in light of their extraordinary abilities. This explanation was then further reaffirmed in the corresponding translations of Episode Ignis. The difficulty came from this not being supported within the English translation, as there was almost no context regarding the name Izunia. It was also similar within the Japanese version, but one of Arden's lines in Chapter 13 would see him acknowledge Izunia as his real name and Lucis Kylum as his formal name, something that supported the French and German translations. Even though it meant there was no definitive answer, when pieced together it felt concrete enough. But when episode Arden released, it muddied the waters further by offering another explanation. Instead of indicating the name Izunia was related to Arden's past, it instead stated that Izunia was the name given to Arden by Vestal upon joining Niflheim. This piece of lore would then be delivered in the same way across each language, as opposed to only being found in one or two of the localization efforts. And due to it being the final piece of content produced, it could therefore be seen as the correct interpretation. This would be further supported by a developer interview conducted by Famitsu. Scenario writer Toru Osanai would end up addressing the matter by explaining that Arden himself could not remember those to whom the surname belonged to due to the overwhelming amounts of information he would take in when absorbing the memories of others. This would see him forget specific factors relative to himself as a result. Additionally, this would also serve to explain Arden's cryptic line about who Izunia was. But even with this answer, the truth is still not 100% clear, and it really comes down to what chain of events players want to believe. The use of flashbacks as a storytelling element has featured quite prominently within the Final Fantasy franchise. Final Fantasy VII and VIII would serve as notable examples, as they frequently employed flashbacks to divulge key plot points. Final Fantasy X would feature a similar narrative device, albeit with a slightly different approach of using spheres. When found, these spheres would often serve as mediums of revelation during various points of the game, but one of its most prominent uses would be at the hands of Jecht, who would record various movie spheres in the hopes of allaying messages to his wife and his son, Tidus. These would appropriately be called Jecht spheres. But what's odd is that the Jecht spheres would actually be one of the few mediums through which we'd really get to know him and his story better, as outside of Yuna, the majority of the denizens of Spira, including many of the main party members, would have next to no knowledge about him. This was particularly strange, as he was an official guardian of High Summer, Nebraska, alongside Auron, both of whom would be hailed as heroes by Spira. It could be argued that part of the reason for this discrepancy was simply that Auron survived, whereas Jecht did not. But that would only make sense in terms of the wider population. This should not have affected characters like Lulu, Waka, and Kamari. They had spent a lot of time with Yuna, and as she seemed to revere and be very fond of Jecht, it seems odd that he would never have been mentioned when conversations veered towards her father's travels. Outside of Yuna, Seymour, of all people, would be one of the few Spirans who actually did know and recognize Jecht, but given his position as a maester, as well as his intricate knowledge regarding the true nature of sin, this wouldn't necessarily be too surprising. While there has often been little discussion about this particular topic, it may be possible to attribute Jecht's obscure status to the dark horse nature of Braska's group. Braska himself had acknowledged that the three of them were considered by the general public to be the least likely candidates to defeat Sin. This was due to their respective outer images, with Braska seen as the summoner married to a heathen Albed, Oren a disgraced warrior monk, and Jecht a drunken blitzball player supposedly from ZANARKAND. When taking this into consideration, the trio were practically nobodies within the realm of Spira. Additionally, one could also argue that Oren was actually not that famous or well known, as those who recognised him were often either Yevonites or Guardians themselves, for example Bartello and Wenkinok. And though one might consider that Jecht should have received recognition for his sacrifice alongside Braska in their conquering of Sin, this may be explained by the fact that the true nature of the final Aeon was not known to many, and Yevon wanted to keep it a secret. Though these are simply conjectures, perhaps there really are valid reasons for Jecht's obscurity, but it's still kind of odd in the grand scheme of things. Over the years, Final Fantasy games have taken the fantasy aspect to whole new levels. It's seen the production of fantastic worlds, the existence of creatures like chocobos and moogles, and both magic and technology that was just awesome. But while all of these in some vein would generally come across to players as being within the realms of possibility within the established lore, there have been other occurrences where a little bit of context is required. And one particular instance of this would be Cid Polendina's remarkable survival after enduring a simultaneous fall and explosion in Final Fantasy IV. As the party attempted to flee the underworld on the Enterprise, they were relentlessly pursued by the Red Wings, causing them to be thrown off course. Cid, in an effort to ensure the safety of the remaining members, would bravely sacrifice himself by leaping off the ship and bombing the entrance to the underworld, effectively trapping the Red Wings and preventing them from chasing the Enterprise any further. Cid's efforts would be successful, and due to how successful they were, the party believed that he had died. And this would be logical. After all, Cid jumped from a fast-moving airship from an incredible height, all while triggering a bomb that exploded right around him. Even in a fantasy world, the chances of surviving such circumstances would be extremely slim and nearly impossible to imagine. However, against all odds, Cid managed to defy convention and survive the harrowing experience, and he would later be found in the Cave of the Dwarves, receiving medical attention at their infirmary. But it begged the question, how exactly was he able to endure such a calamitous ordeal? Now, Cid was renowned for his hot-blooded and obstinate nature, alongside his ability to maintain physical prowess despite his advanced age. Based on this, perhaps it was his sheer willpower that enabled him to fight on against the odds and survive, or perhaps the dwarves just have some kind of advanced medical techniques. Either way, that Cid survived in the manner he did has always been a point of contention. But interestingly, this wouldn't be the last time a character would survive near impossible odds. In Final Fantasy VII, for example, Dyne would endure a gunshot wound and fall into a crevice. It would later be discovered that he lived through the incident with only a gunshot wound to his hand. And that brings us on to our final mystery, where we arrive at what perhaps might be the most strange and puzzling occurrence in the franchise, the Lunar Cry in Final Fantasy VIII. The Lunar Cry was defined as a catastrophic phenomenon that occurred when there was an excessive number of monsters on the moon's surface, causing them to overflow and plummet in large quantities onto the Earth's surface. It would be cited as the source of the monsters that plagued the world of Final Fantasy VIII, and we also learned that the phenomenon could also be induced through the use of the lunatic Pandora. In ancient history, the Lunar Cry was responsible for completely wiping out the Cetran civilization, and it was also responsible for creating the giant crater in Trabia. In the present timeline of the game, the Lunar Cry would happen once again, induced by Cypher under Ultima Seer's orders in an effort to retrieve Sorceress Adele's tomb, which was located in the moon's orbit. But even though the Lunar Cry was framed as an important and cataclysmic occurrence in the game, it will be rife with oddities and conflicting details. For one, the explanation as to how it occurs is never really explained. According to the Final Fantasy VIII Ultimania, the Lunar Cry was a product of gravity, and it was likened to that of a tidal force. but that doesn't explain how it would result in a stream of monsters pouring out from the moon in a single column that would then crash into Earth. One might think that, as a Final Fantasy title, it would instead reference magic as some kind of influence for its occurrence, but that was not the case. Additionally, the two previous instances of the lunar cry would end up having clear destructive results, the first causing a mass extinction, and the second resulting in a huge crater. But for some reason, the lunar cry that took place at Tears Point in the present timeline didn't seem to have any apparent effect at all, either from a physical perspective or from the perspective of there being a huge monster infestation. With this in mind, it begs the question as to what the overarching purpose of the lunar cry was, as the only real result of this supposed calamity would be Ultimacia's retrieval of Sorceress Adele's tomb. Some speculation would perhaps suggest it was an attempt to dig deeper into the dimensional themes of space and time that were featured in Final Fantasy VIII, but on the other hand, it could simply have just been a moment to serve a cool-looking FMV. But the lack of its overall influence on the overarching plot, as well as the world in general, would just make it a questionable occurrence teeming with irregularities. And with that, we're done. Those were 7 unexplained Final Fantasy mysteries. If there's a mystery or phenomenon you're curious about, please let us know in the comments below, and I'm sure a discussion will start up. And if you've enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Chris M. Walker, The Livestream, Elsa Claire Farron, Galsin Dikajata, Gregory, Justin Dent, Lord of Morning, and Zukin TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.